Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, which is all about, I'm slouching, which is all about working with layers. So we're going to start simple and look at all the kind of additional stuff that you can do with layers. We'll look at the simple tool metrics, brush dynamics. I can never say that. And then move into more advanced things like luminosity masking, using the color editor and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm going to assume, let's just turn me down in the background. I'm going to assume that you don't really know much about layers. So as I said, we will be starting simple, but then we'll ramp up as we go through. Now, before we start, just a couple of housekeeping things. Just to remind you that we have a maximum of 60 minutes today. We could probably talk for 2 hours about layers, but we won't. We'll keep it to 60 minutes. I am recording this. You'll get an automated email sometime tomorrow when it's ready to go on YouTube. So don't worry if you miss anything at all. You're very welcome and encouraged to use the chat room as you have seen right now. So obviously that's public, so you can use that for heckling, chatting with each other and being nice. Of course, if you want to ask a specific question, and you're very welcome to, of course, then put that in the Q&A tab, because that just simply means that I can find you guys or the questions much easier than rather it disappearing in the chat, as there is rather a lot of you. So just remember that. If you put a question in the chat and it miraculously disappears, it probably means that I've just moved it over to the Q&A to remind me. Now, if chatting or asking questions is not your thing, you can hit the little down arrow in the top right hand corner, and then that will give you a bit more real estate on screen to see what's going on with Capture One. Excuse me. So let us begin. So we need my screen up, that would help. So as I said, first of all, we're just going to explain some of the basics around working with layers. Now, the whole premise of working with a layer is that first of all, you need to know where the layers tool is, and in the default workspace it's actually stuck to the top of these three tool tabs, or very close to the top. So in the color tool tab, in the exposure tool tab, and the details tool tab. And the reason for that is that these are the kind of tool sets that you might like to use when working with layers. And the whole idea of a layer, of course, is that you have different ways to draw a mask. For example, this could be a brush. And then those adjustments will only happen on that masked area. So for example, if I right click or control click to bring up my brush parameters, let's just make that a bit smaller. I'll explain these in a second. When I start drawing, let's just make a new layer. When I start drawing, if you press M on your keyboard, you can see the mask. Now, wherever I draw this mask, if I was to then make an adjustment like exposure, then that only happens on that masked area. So that's the super basic principle of working with layers. Now let's just delete that layer like so. Now there's lots of different ways to create, if I just bring that up again, lots of different ways to create this mask. So we can use a brush, we can do gradients, we can do radials, we can use the color editor, we can do all kinds of different things to create that mask. And we can also vary how the mask looks in terms of its opacity and shape, refining edges, all kinds of different things. This is why this subject could be quite deep, of course. So we'll run through some simple examples. So we're just going to look at basic mask drawing. We've got a gradient example here and then a radial example that we can look at. Oop, let's zoom out, and then we move on to things like different brush dynamics, like using flow, Luma Range control, which is pretty cool, styles on layers, and also a bit about color grading, and then any other extra stuff that we can come up with as well. So let's start with the basics. So I'm going to pick this photo again, and this one is without any layers at all. So let's focus on what we're going to do. So this shot already has some basic adjustments to it, but let's consider, you know, the kind of things that we could do for this shot that would make sense in terms of a layer. So right now, if we look at our details tool tab, we can see that sharpening is turned off, or it's down to 0, because this shot, it's a shallow depth of field shot, and there isn't a great deal in focus except for our subject, which is our smoothie, I guess, or breakfast. So I could argue I want to make this stand out a bit more, so I could do that with sharpening, clarity, a bit of structure, and so on. There's not a huge amount of benefit to sharpening the background because it's out of focus. So, steps to create a layer. Good practice, first of all, let's make a new layer, and we're going to call that smoothie. It's a good idea to name your layers, because otherwise you end up in the situation of having a bunch of layers. The maximum is 16, so you can't have more than 16, called layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have no idea which each one does. So giving it a name certainly does help. So I'm going to grab my brush, like so. I'm going to go over to my shot. Now the first 2 sliders is the only thing we're going to look at right now. We're going to come back to these, and we've got size, obviously, how big the brush is, and hardness. So that's how it rolls off onto the edges, so the smoothness. Now the reason why there's 2 circles is because the inner circle is where your brush is at max opacity, if you like, 100%, and by the time it's reached the outer circle, it's faded to 0. So that's, if you like, the feather pattern. So I'm going to make this a little bit harder, so let's go around here and we're going to start drawing. Now you can see the mask is visible in red, so I'm not going to do anything particularly fancy. I'm just going to fill this in like so. To see your mask, or to hide the mask, then it's going to be using the keyboard shortcut M. So if you press M on your keyboard, then you can see the mask on and off like so. Now I've made a mistake, so I'm going to pick my erase brush, that's this guy here, and then just get rid of that. Now press M again, and now we're free to adjust what we want to. So I'm going to sharpen this up a little bit more, so let's just boost up the sharpening. Add a bit of halo suppression, that gets rid of any sort of nasty halos, and we could also add a bit of clarity as well, like so. And it's getting a bit dark over here, so let's pull up the blacks, for example. So that's just a real, let's hide my browser, that's just a real simple edit. We can turn the layer on and off with the check mark, so you can see before and after, like so. Now also, now that we have that layer active, if I wanted to add this adjustment anywhere else, then I would just need to brush. So if I start brushing here, as if by magic, then those adjustments pop up in that place as well. Let's zoom back out, so like so. And again, if I press M, you can see the mask. Easy peasy. Now, another way to visualize masks, and we're going to get onto this a bit later, just so you know it's here, under this menu, you can see the shortcut for show and hide. There's another option which will only show the mask when you're drawing, so it kind of pops on when you're drawing and disappears straight away. I find that a bit annoying, so I like to just manually turn the mask on and off. The interesting one is display grayscale mask. So this shows the mask as a grayscale. Now note for the future how this mask looks. It's black where there's no masking and white where there is masking. Okay, black and white. So you can see where the mask is. Now the reason why that's useful, we're going to come to when we start using more sophisticated brush dynamics like flow. So hold that thought. Now finally, if red is not your favorite color and you want something else, or it's hard to see on the image you're adjusting, if you go to the preferences, like so, and then over on under, where is it? I can never remember where it is. Appearance. Let's try appearance. There we go. So down here, mask color, like so. So over there, you can change that to anything you like, but the default is red. Okie dokie. Now, quick check on questions. So that should cover off the basics. Captain Jack, we'll get back to you. Jan says, how do you stop losing layers when you upgrade from Capture One 11, 12 or earlier? You shouldn't lose the layers. That was an early bug in Capture One 20.01 or something like that. So make sure you're on the latest .04 and that should be fine. If you're on subscription, Jim, no, you don't need to upgrade anything. The whole point of subscription, you never need to upgrade. You're just paying as and when, and you always have rights to everything. Klaus says, why do you call it a mask when other programs call it a selection? Well, I guess selection can often be like a path selection or a lasso or something like this. So technically it's a mask, and in Photoshop, the closest thing to this would be the quick mask, which also shows in red. So there we go. Pen type stuff we'll come back to in a second, because we can talk about that at the end, because I'm using a pen. It's not a requirement, but I think it makes the task easier. All right, let's move on to the next kind of basic example. So we saw that you could create masks just using a brush. Now additionally, sometimes that doesn't make sense. So we've got some basic edits on this photo. Let's actually reset it and do that. So we're going to straighten up the horizon with our straighten tool up the top here. Crop wise, let's just change the crop a little bit. Now it's a bit on the bright side, so I'm going to bring the exposure down and the brightness, which is more a mid-tone adjustment. Add a bit of contrast, and let's move my clarity tool up. Don't know why it disappeared down there. And a bit of clarity as well. Now I'd like to darken the sky a little more, but the foreground is fine. So a graduated filter makes sense. I could just brush in the whole sky, but that's not particularly the fastest way of calling it. The fastest way of doing it. So we can use this guy, which is our gradient mask, like so. Now the icon looks slightly different on screen, as you can see up here at the top. So when we start drawing, then you're going to see 3 lines pop up like so. Now if I hold down Shift, that's going to keep them horizontal or perfectly vertical or at 45 degrees. So I want these nice and horizontal, so I'm going to hold down Shift and then draw my gradient. Now if I press M on the keyboard, you can see the fall off that it creates. So again, if I just hover my cursor over the screen, where's my cursor gone? Over here. You can see the 3 lines that it creates. So the top line is obviously where our gradient starts. By the time we get to the center line, we're at 50%. And then by the time we get to the last line, we're at 0. So that's your fall off. Now, if that fall off is too gradual for you, you can make it asymmetric, is the technical term. So if you hold down your Alt key, like so, grab the bottom line, then we can change our fall off to be asymmetric, not symmetrical. So now I've got an asymmetrical gradient like so. So if I come off the screen, press M, now I'm free to adjust that area. So I could make this a little bit darker, more contrasty. No, let's not do that, and so on. So gradient mask, super simple. Now at any point, and you'll see this with the radial, if you feel that that's not right, we can move it around. I can go to the center line, change the angle. We can change the symmetricalness, if that's a word. So we can change it to be different as well. So if I hold down Shift, I think this is another shortcut. If I hold down Shift, then you see both outer lines will move around the center line like so. So you've got loads of control over the fall off. So that's making a gradient mask. Now, important point, first of all, name your layers, grad sky. Now, if I wanted to do another gradient, then that's got to be on another layer. So if I was to start drawing another gradient, it would overwrite that previous one. So it's one gradient per layer. So if I wanted to have one in the foreground, I'd make a new layer and then drop that one in like so. So very important, only one kind of gradient mask per layer. Now the second kind of gradient mask is, let's pull up this shot, is a radial, so which is like a fancy vignette for want of a better word. So similar process to the gradient mask. You'll find it over here. Again, it's the radial looking shape. Am I fit screen? Yes. So when we start drawing, notice that the icon looks a bit different. It's now got a circle next to it. When we start drawing, so let's draw a circle, then we see a similar kind of shape going on, but now radial. So same principle applies. 100% on the outer circle, 50 to 0, like so. And then we've got 4 handles around the outside. So this allows me to change the shape to circular, to more oval, and so on. And grabbing the inner or outer circle allows you to change the feathering. Now these are always symmetric. We can't make a radial a radial mask, lost my head. We can't make that asymmetric, so it's always going to be like so. Now again, if I press M on my keyboard, you can see how the radial looks, like so. And then now we can use any combination of adjustments to tweak that down, etc. Again, name your layers. So this is our radial. Now a couple of other extra things to note about the radial mask as well is that by default when you start drawing the radial mask, it's going to be, I'm not sure what the correct term is, the mask is going to be on the outside, if you like. So the unaffected area is going to be in the middle. So if you want the inverse of that, for example, let's just move this. Was that Peony was asking, how do I incline it? Do you mean rotate? Just hover over the center and then you can twist it like so. Now if you want the opposite effect, you want the mask in the middle or inside, you can right click, and by default you can set it up to always draw the mask inside if that's your preferred, or you can right click on the layer itself and say invert. So if we do invert, then it's going to go like so. Right click and invert once again, and that works on any mask, not just radial masks. If you've drawn a mask and you want to invert it, then you can do so like so. The other option is you can grab the outer line and you can force it over the middle, and then it will snap to the inside like so. So plenty of different options. And the nice thing is, of course, again, it's dynamic. So if you always want to go back and then just edit that mask, you can do so. And then you'll see the effect in real time. So if I bring the brightness right down and then we play with this, whoops, definitely saw it in real time there. Let's spin that again and so on. Then you can see exactly how it's going to look. So it's pretty neat. It's a really powerful radial tool. Okay, that deals with our sort of 3 basic ways to build a mask. So with a brush, with a gradient, with a radial mask. Now Kelvin, there's no prioritization, and also someone else was asking about collapsing layers. Remember, this is all non-destructive editing, so you can't merge layers because that would fundamentally change the pixels or the data in the file. So you can't merge layers because we're doing non-destructive editing, not pixel editing. And secondly, there's no prioritization for the layers. It doesn't matter what order they're in, again, because it's non-destructive. And is it the same as Photoshop? Kind of, but again, because of non-destructive and also the fact that you can't, say, have 5 layers, merge them down, you know, you have a restriction in that case, but you have much more flexibility because you're working with raw data, and again, it's non-destructive. But there's lots of similarities with Photoshop. Photoshop, you can do more. Of course, you've got different blend modes. You could add masks to particular layers, and you know, all kinds of other stuff. So it's similar, but it's not identical. All right, let's just have a check on other questions. Does it automatically create a layer when you use a radial mask? Yes. Yes and no. So let's get rid of this radial mask by hitting minus. Now if there's no layers present and I draw a radial, you see it makes a layer for me. Same goes for if I draw a gradient mask, then it creates a layer for me. Same goes if I grab a brush and start to draw, then it creates a layer for me. But now from this point, if I now wanted to do a radial mask as well, if I draw a radial here, it's just going to overwrite that current layer. So the initial layer creation is kind of done automatically, but after that you need to make your own layers, as it were. So let's see. The Alt allows asymmetric radials. It doesn't actually, Tim, unless something's changed. Pretty sure it doesn't. So if I hold Alt key down, See, it's still symmetrical. It doesn't change the spacing in between those lines. So that only works on the gradient. So sorry to disappoint you there. And Andy, correct. Layers are totally non-destructive. So obviously if you go crazy with pulling adjustments all over the place, then yes, you might start to see errors, but that's not destructing pixels, that's over editing. Cool. All right. So shortcuts we'll come back to, because there's a whole bunch of shortcuts, and that can help speed up your workflow. I don't tend to show the shortcuts here because then it makes it very difficult for you guys to follow. Okay, so let's go and look at really one of the most powerful aspects when you're drawing mask with a brush, and that's using flow. So we've got an image example here. It has some base adjustments. So I've done some, what have we done? Let's look at it out of the box, as it were. It looks like this. So it's had a little exposure and contrast bump and some clarity, and that's it. Now looking into this area, let's just hide the browser. I want to get a bit more kind of life going on in here because there's some fun things going on which I want to see. But if I open up the blacks more, so let's do that. So if I open up the blacks, now this is looking a bit sort of nasty, fake HDR going on. I only really want to open up this area. So just kind of around here, just subtly, just a little bit. So I want to control where the blacks is. So based on what you and I have learnt so far, what you could do is grab a brush and you could think, right, I want to open up this area. So I'm going to kind of draw a mask here. Something like that. That's kind of what I'm thinking, like so. Hide my mask and now try and open up the blacks. That still looks pretty kind of weird and fake. So that's not a good way to do it. What we want to do is build up this adjustment slowly. Now I can show you sort of two different techniques. The first one I'm going to show you is how I used to do it. The second one is how I do it now. The second one, I believe, gives you more control and a better end result. So, first technique is to do this. I'm just going to zoom in a bit so you guys can see easier. Is that I'm going to look at my black slider and think, okay, how much kind of do I want to go? So I'm not sure. So I probably want to push it about this much. So I'm going to make a new layer and call this blacks, like so, and I'm going to bump it up to whatever it was, somewhere around here. Grab my brush and now start brushing so I can see the effect get painted in. Now once again you're going to agree that looks pretty bad, so let's right click and clear the mask. That just gets rid of your mask but not your adjustment, and we're going to right click and we're going to take the flow down to something nice and low. And what flow does is change the way that the mask is built up. So at 100%, as soon as you start moving the brush, it's going to paint in your entire adjustment. So that's plus 55 black in one brush stroke or one mouse stroke. Exactly the same, not relying on using a pen. If we turn flow down to something like 5, then that's 5%. So one pass of the brush will give you 5%. So if I go painting back and forth, it'll build up in 5% increments. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so on. So I get, if you like, 10 passes to reach my maximum opacity, which is set above here, which is currently 100. So it'll max out at 100, which means 55 on the black. So now when I start brushing, if I brush back and forth here, then it gradually starts to open up that area like so. So it's not boom all in one go. It allows me a gradual build up, which looks a lot more natural. So now if we zoom out a bit, maybe not that much, and we just turn this layer on and off, now it's a lot more believable because it was built up slowly. Now if you think, darn it, I've overcooked it a bit too much, then of course we can switch to erase. And now the important thing is to have this one checked, which makes sure the brush and eraser settings are exactly the same. So now if I start erasing, I'm going to be erasing in 5% brush strokes, like so. So I can go back and forth, I can press B, I can say, well, let's just open up this hut a little bit more. And now if I go to E, that was a bit too much, so let's just kill that one. Now if it's happening too fast, then you can take flow down. If it's happening too quickly, sorry, that was the same. If it's happening too quickly, the adjustment is coming in too quickly, then you can reduce your flow. If it's not coming in fast enough and you're brushing, then you can move the flow up. But I'm normally around 5-ish% roughly. And equally, what you can also do is grab the opacity slider and you can go from 0 to 100 like so. So that works super nicely. Now that's the way I prefer to do it. I'm going to get rid of that layer. Is you could argue it's slightly longer, but I would say you get a better result. And once you get quick at it, especially using shortcuts, I think you'd actually be faster and less frustrated. So what I do is I start with a new filled layer. So this creates a new layer, but it straight away fills it with a mask over the whole area. So if I press M now, you can see my whole shot is covered in a mask. So think of this for those of you who are used to Photoshop or Affinity Photo, for example. There is, sorry, I lost my thread then. It's like an adjustment layer. So it's kind of giving yourself another background, if you like. So also, if you want to separate out your adjustments into different layers, even if it's just filled layers, that's also a tactic that you can do. So it's now filled over the whole shot. So what I can do is think, okay, I want to open up this area. How am I going to do it? So I think blacks work quite nicely. So I can see, okay, the black slider does this. The shadow slider does that. So those two work quite nicely. Maybe I could open up with a curve or something like that. So I can play around with different adjustments and see what works quite nicely. Now I think black probably works just fine for this, or a combination of the two. So I can visualize what's going on. The first method only really works if you're using one adjustment. This method works better if you want to combine a few different adjustments. Like right now, opening up the blacks, has it gone a bit flat? So is it better if I just add a bit of contrast and maybe some clarity as well? So I can combine a whole bunch of different adjustments and see what's going on. Okay, I'm happy with that's a good result based on where I'm going to paint it. So now I can name this. So let's just call this huts or whatever. Right click and say clear mask. Remember, that's just going to zap the mask, but those tweaks that I made, you can see on the sliders here, they're still active. So now when I grab my brush, same principle as before, zoom in a bit, right click, nice low flow, let's make it a bit softer. Now I can go back in and then we can just open up those areas where I think it needs it. And if I brush a bit more here, that's going to open it up more, and I could even focus a bit on this side of the hut. And I'm not being super critical because my adjustment is targeted in the shadow. So I'm not worried if I'm over painting over here because the black slider is not going to affect this area. So I'm not worried about cutting perfectly around things. That's just going to take too much time. But I can easily just open up these different areas. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, like so, and turn our huts off and back on, then we can see the effect that it's made. More sophisticated than the first method. Time-wise, probably almost the same, but just allows a much better pre-visualization of what's going on. Now, if you remember, we spoke about that grayscale mask. So when we looked at our smoothie, let's go back to the smoothie for a second. So when we looked at our smoothie, option M, so that's how our grayscale mask looks. White is masked area, black is not masked. Now if we go back to our flow, this is our shot with the grayscale mask. So now you can see we've got all those levels of density from white to black. So we've got greys in there as well. So this is maximum adjustment where it's almost pure white, and then fading out to a much smaller adjustment around those edges where we've got the grayscale. So hope that makes sense, but it's really one of the best kind of methods to improve using of layers to make nice natural looking masks that don't, you know, have hard edges or a nasty sort of HDR effect or anything like that. Okay, couple of questions, then we'll do the same thing with this guy as well. Let's have a look. So let's just add this to the Q&A, Francois, just so I don't lose it. So fill mask always goes to 100. Yes. Actually, when you create a new filled layer, let's just be specific here. When we say a new filled layer, that's always to 100%. Now, if you are to right click on a layer and say fill, if you've drawn like a 50% opacity brush or something, then it will fill to 50 as far as I can remember. Why do I prefer flow to opacity? Because it means you can keep your mouse or pen in contact with the surface or your desk or whatever and effectively paint. So if you imagine you've got a good old pen and pencil here. So if I draw with my pencil, this is effectively what you're doing with flow, is you're making it darker and darker. Now, if flow is on 100 and you have opacity set to 50%, it would be like this kind of thing. If opacity was set to 100%, then it would be like me pressing really hard. So you don't get those levels of control. What you have to do with opacity, if I set opacity to 5, I could do a similar thing, but I would have to draw, lift, draw, lift, draw, lift. Whereas using the flow method, I'm effectively sketching. So it's much more natural to do it that way than use opacity. Okay, shortcuts we'll come back to. There's shortcuts for everything. So let's have a look. Is there an easy-ish way, Andy says, to mask the horizon line instead of using a grad mask? Well, hold that thought because we'll use a Luma mask example, which could help you in the future. Stefan, if I have overlapping layers, do the upper layers always work on the background image or on the next lower layer? It works on everything. So just imagine like you've got a 3D stack of layers. All those adjustments will be additive throughout the whole stack. So it won't miss anything out, essentially. Okie dokie. Let's have a look. Matthew says, last question, do you feel the new white and black sliders work as well as or better than using a curve style adjustment? Certainly faster. And you have to remember that sliders have quite a lot of intelligence built into them and smart algorithms, which is maybe more than a simple curve can do. So since I've got the white and black sliders, my use of curves actually has become less and less. Now curves allow you, if you like, the ultimate control freak sophistication, but it doesn't necessarily always do a better job than a slider. It's like an old sort of anti-slider movement, if you like, that if you're using a slider, you're not being professional because sliders are dumb. That's not the case. There's loads of smart stuff under the hood of a slider, which actually gives a very good result. Okay, so another example with flow. I actually did this yesterday in a live broadcast. So if you've already seen this, then I'm sorry, but for the benefit of people who weren't watching live, then we can see it again. By the way, this little button I just clicked here, this is called the proof margin. So that just gives you a bit of space around the shot, which is sometimes handy if you're masking near to the edge. Just gives you a bit more space, which I'm going to. So again, this photo has a few adjustments, warmed up, bit of an exposure bump and so on. Now the sky has some good stuff going on there. So again, I'm going to make a new filled layer. Let's call this sky, like so. And I want to make the sky jump out a bit more. So what's going to make that happen? Is it clarity? Yes, so let's heap in loads of clarity. Is it contrast? Not really. could I do something with the curves? Going back to Matthew. So I want to make this bit kind of darker. So I can grab my curve picker, click on that, and that tells me where that tone is. So now I can think, okay, let's bring that sky down a bit to something like that. Now I'm overdoing it because I know when I brush it in, I'm not going to go that far. So there's that. So now, once again, that's a combination of curve, and we've got a bit of clarity in there as well. We could even drop brightness maybe a little. Now I need to right click and say clear mask. Grab my brush, going to make this nice and big, relatively soft, flow nice and low again. And now I can just kind of almost copy the shape of the sky to some extent, just to bring out a couple of those darker areas, maybe a bit up here and a bit there. Now I've gone too far there, so I'm going to press E on my keyboard for erase and just take that back out. Go B for brush again, do a little bit more here, and even if I felt, okay, this house down here, that might benefit from a bit, I can throw a bit in there as well, and so on. So now if I turn this layer off and back on, you can see what it's done. Again, if I've gone too far, we've got the added flexibility of opacity, so we can always go from 0 up to 100 to decide where the balance is about right, which I'm going to go for that. So nice and easy, and again, starting with that filled layer, I believe gives you the benefit of working with more than one adjustment to visualize what's going on, and then painting it in where you feel fit. Okay, a couple of questions, and Kevin says, so opacity always at 100%. I think so, because we've got the ability to change opacity here, so I don't really see any benefit in modifying it here. So it's always at the max for me, whereas flow down here I keep to 5. Now some people prefer having flow at 100 and opacity down super low, and then they do multiple brushes. But I just find that kind of counterintuitive and annoying, so I use flow like this as it was intended. Cool. Mario says the sky is too yellow. Well, that's easy to fix. We could go to our color balance tool and we could make it whatever we like. So we could go towards the blues, for example. We could just push it any color that we want to. So that is an easy fix. Luma Range, yes, we're going to cover that, don't worry. Layers exported to Photoshop? No, remember, it's not the same thing, because this is a non-destructive edit. It's not going to transpose to Photoshop. Two totally different things. Photoshop is a pixel editor. Capture One and other raw converters work on the raw file, and it's non-destructive, so it cannot be transferred over to Photoshop. Let's have a look. Would be great if the tools used in the layer were highlighted or indicated in some way. It could be nice, actually. Well, highlighted. Oh, I see what you mean. So you know, okay, on my sky layer, I'm using XYZ, for example. Now you can see which tools are layer compatible because they have the little paintbrush. But it could be nice when you pick a layer that if they get highlighted, that might be smart, actually. That could be good. Okay, pen pressure we'll come back to as well, and I think we're good right now. Okay. Oh, that's actually a really good question. How exact do you have to be while drawing a mask, like for edges? As you've seen so far, I haven't been accurate by any stretch of the imagination. Now, I think there's a couple of cases where you might want to be accurate, but that's probably for like interior photography. If you want to go around like a window or a piece of furniture or something like that. Generally, if you start being super accurate around edges, that's when it becomes very obvious that you've done some masking. So if you looked at this shot, do you know that the sky has been changed locally? Probably not. If we look at this shot, do you know that there's a little tweak going on there, or do you think that's just naturally how it looked? No. If we'd done the first method of 100% mask and just gone cut around the edge of this mountain, then we're into nasty looking sort of HDR effect. So the more seamless and gradual you can make the mask, remember if we look at our grayscale mask, the more believable it's going to be. Now, if you did have an object, again, there's the mask on this one. If you did have an object that you wanted to cut round, here's a tip. So if we grab our brush and make it much harder, and I start with a dot, so let's press M, oops, let's go full flow so we can see it, and we start with a dot. If I hold down Shift and click once, it'll draw a straight line. So if you want to draw around a square, for example, then you can do so. And to save you having to do this and fill it in, you can right click and say fill, and then it will fill the rest of the mask in, like so. So Shift will allow you to draw straight lines. So you could have like a super tiny brush, for example, and then we could draw around different objects as we see fit. And then of course we can right click and say fill mask, like so. But generally, the more seamless, natural, varied mask you can make, the more believable in that it looks as well. Cool. Let's have a look. What are we doing next? Mental brain fart. Luma Range. Okay, a few of you have asked about this. This is an awesome shot, and it's actually part of a blog post from a photographer out in Beijing. And I picked up this shot. He posted about it on Reddit in the Capture One group, and wrote a really nice blog post about how he went through and started with this and ended up with this. So next week, actually, I'll run through the full edit on a live broadcast. We probably don't have time for that now because we've still got other stuff to cover. But what we can look at is the luminosity mask side of things. So here is the shot with some basic edits, but we've still got a fair amount of work to do. So this is out of camera. This is with a few edits, but you can see we've still got a fair amount to do in this section of the shot, like so. So by using a Luma mask, then we've managed to get to this. So how do we use luminosity masks? Well, first of all, you can see in the layers tool itself that we've got a button here called Luma Range. Now, right now it's grayed out. So you think, is it broken? Does it not work or whatever? But the important concept to realize is that, sorry, be quiet you. The important concept to realize is that the Luma mask is applying a constraint on a mask that you have already drawn. So if I draw a mask with a brush, or I make a radial mask, or a gradient mask, or a filled mask, we're then saying, okay, Capture One, here's the mask, now apply some luminosity constraint to it. So you have to start with a mask for the Luma Range to work. So in this case, I'm going to say, let's make a new filled layer, and we're going to call this greenery, like so. And if we press M, we can see the whole mask. Now what I want to do, and I think this was, who was asking, can't remember, someone about, do I have to cut carefully? Now I would just want to kind of darken this area down at the bottom. So I could do a hand drawn mask and so on, but it's quite a complex shape around here. And in this case, I think maybe fitting the mask nicely would make sense. So if I press M, you can see the mask is set over the whole shot. Now if I press Luma Range, then this little tool pops up. Capture One will work in the background a second to kind of build a map. And then what we can do is cut out parts of that mask like so. So we've got shadows to highlights. So obviously if I cut out the highlights, then we end up with something like that. If we bring this one up, then we do the opposite. We'd cut out the shadows and we'd end up with just the sky. Pretty neat, huh? So I want to cut this down until we just have something roughly like that. So that's excluded my sky, and we've got full masking around this area, and then it's rolling off nicely into this tones. So the roll off or fall off is denoted by the sliders at the bottom. So if I pull this one in like that, you see now it gets really binary around the outside. If I open this one up, then that's going to bleed nicer into the tone. So it's not, if you like, a hard stop. So now if I press apply, this is the mask that we're dealing with. Now what you might prefer is that when you're making luminosity masks, is that before you go into the Luma Range dialog, is to turn on display grayscale mask. So now if we go back into Luma Range, then you can see really exactly, like if I open this up again, you see just above my head that kind of bit of flare there. We want to get rid of that, and now it's super easy to see exactly what areas we're covering. So I'm going to go settle with something like that and say apply. Job done. So that looks, you know, super nice. So if I press M on my keyboard, then we can come out of that. Now we're free to just edit this zone. So what I'm going to do is to fix that, I'm going to bring the levels in so we can up the contrast a bit, and then whack in a bunch of clarity because it's only happening in that area. And now also let's bump up the saturation as well. Easy peasy. Now that's way faster to do it like that with the Luma Range than, you know, hand drawing or doing a few other bits. Now one other tip that we can look at. So let's go, it's a lovely shot. It's on a GFX 50. It's super duper sharp. Who fancies going up that bridge? Not me. Okay, so now let's look at the edge of the mask. So I'm going to put on my grayscale mask like so. Now we can see around the edge, it's a little bit crude. No, it's quite hard. So do we want to soften that up a little bit? So we can use a couple of different additional tools to do so. And this works on any mask as well. So if we right click, I can say feather or refine. So if I went to feather mask and I tried to do something, let's just bump it up to 100. It's working. Thinking about it, nothing's happening. That's weird. Why is that? Because remember, we're feathering my field mask, not the actual result. So nothing's going to happen. So that's a bit of a head scramble to get around, because you would think, okay, if I feather the mask, shouldn't I see the edge feather? No, because remember, our actual mask is the field mask, and the Luma Range tool is putting a constraint on that. So we're actually feathering the edge of a field mask. So that kind of doesn't work. So we could try something else. We could say, okay, well, let's try and refine my mask. Let's bump this up to 300. Let Capture One work. Weird, nothing's happening again. That's annoying. Again, we're refining the edge of our field mask. So let's cancel that out. But fortunately in Luma Range, those two functions are built in. So we've got two sliders, radius and sensitivity. Now at 0, when radius is at 0, the sensitivity slider has no effect because it doesn't have like a space to work because it's at 0. So when we bump up the radius, then Capture One will start looking at how this mask has been built. And you'll see as I increase that, and it will start to spread out from the edge of the mask and define how those edges look. Now, right now with sensitivity in the middle, we've got a balance between feathering and refining the mask. So if I go to 0, the mask now gets feathered. If I go to 100, it's going to refine, which means it's going to kind of suck around the edges. And the bigger I make the radius, you'll see the more that's going to travel from either side of my mask, like so. So it makes it nice and subtle. Now, how does that look on the shot itself? So let's turn off the grayscale mask. So if I go sensitivity to 0, you're going to see we've got like the mist is just kind of spilling over the edge of the shot, which might look quite nice. If we go to 100, my adjustment is going to snap tightly around the edges. Now, whatever looks better, that's kind of down to you. So if we turn that off, let's bring Luma Range back up. So if I go to 0, so you can see the mist is kind of enveloping over the side. 100, then it snaps around to the edge. So I think I would probably go somewhere in between, maybe about there kind of thing. So this is a super duper powerful tool. Sometimes it's, you know, it takes a little bit of tweaking to get use out of it as well. but it's super nice. Now that was with a field mask. Now if I'd done another thing, so let's just grab a brush. Let's just say I do a crude sort of mask like this, like so. Now when I hit Luma Range, we can pretty much achieve the same thing, like so, because it's putting that constraint on the currently drawn mask. Now you can do this on a gradient mask, you can do it on a radial mask, with a drawn mask, with a filled mask. So any mask that you create in Capture One, you can then put on top of that Luma Range constraint as well. So that's, just remember, like, to get in your head exactly how the process works. Make a mask, put a Luma Range constraint on it. So Luma Range does not create the mask, it puts a constraint on a mask that you have made. So that's really important to denote. We can invert the range as well, don't know what would happen here, so that's just kind of flipping it like so. But it really is a super duper cool tool. So to edit this shot without that, you know, would have been quite difficult. And we can see the dramatic difference that we have. Looks perfectly natural and believable. We don't have any sort of weird kind of posterization going on here or anything like that. It's just seamlessly blended in from those darker tones to going out into the highlights. So it's built the perfect mask for you, if you like. Okay, that was quite a long explanation, but it's a really super nice feature. Let's have a look. Marvelous, Xavier says. Yep. And Alice says, gonna spare so much time. And don't forget, actually, let's say no matter how much you'd kind of spent on this mask, let's say we had like a rogue bit of mask up here or something like that, I can still erase this part. So let's say I didn't want this bit in, I could still erase that bit out, because remember, I'm putting a constraint on that mask again. So if there's like a little bit of, you know, rogue mask somewhere, let's just fill that mask again. Fill mask. Hang on, clear mask, and let's say fill mask. There we go. Luma Range. Let's just bring that back down. So let's say you add like a cloud up here or something like that. You can still delete those parts of the mask and so on. Now this is dynamic, so there's one other option which I didn't mention, which I should. So note there's the little sunshine next to that layer, denoting it has a Luma Range constraint on it. So I can always go back in and tweak that as I would want to. Now if it comes to the point where I want to really kind of start doing a load of brushwork on there, I can right click and say rasterize. You can also do this on radial and gradient masks. So as soon as I say rasterize, it will just kind of stick the mask as it is. So now if I say rasterize, the little Luma sunshine goes away, and now this mask kind of behaves as if I'd drawn it myself. So I could, you know, erase bits of it, we could add to bits of it. Now if I wanted to, we could go in and right click and say refine, and then I would get my refine tools popping up, and they would work as you would expect because it's working on the actual mask. Same goes if I went for feather mask and just max that out. You can see it's just feathering around the edges as well. So rasterize will stick the mask in its current state, but then you lose the ability to retrospectively change the Luma mask and so on. So long-winded explanation, but let's just go back to the one that I did yesterday, and you can see the result is super nice. Cool, my mind is blown, Captain Jack. That's good, you're not bored. Excellent. Let's have a look at some other questions. So being non-destructive, Andy says, are there no issues with color shifts in Capture One when dodging and burning using curves? Yeah, I would say if you're dodging and burning using curves, use the Luma curve. Because that's purely just a luminosity change. It doesn't affect the color, whereas RGB would. So if you want to use curves, use the Luma curve. Simon says, will you show the curve picker again? Yep, sure, no problem. Let's see, pen pressure we'll come back to just to fill in at the end. Conscious we've only got 5 minutes left, so I think we'll move on. I think we've answered most of your questions. What was the last thing I was going to talk about? Very quick thing, styles. Styles as a layer, something else that pops up. So if you're using styles, so let's say you want to apply a style to this shot, bit of extra flexibility. Before actually applying the style, right click, because that's a bit heavy handed, it's kind of getting too contrasty, right click and say apply to new layer. And now when we look at the style, it's actually its own style layer, which we can turn off and on, and we can change the opacity to blend exactly how we like. And of course we can mix it with, you know, our other corrections that we want to add in and have our nice little style layer as well. So that's right click and apply to layer. Just something worth mentioning. Color grading, another use of a filled layer. So I'm going to make a new filled layer and let's call that color grade, like so. And now again, this is on the whole shot because it gives me extra flexibility to, let's say if we go to our color balance tool, I just want to do the typical tealy, tealy shadow, warmer highlights kind of thing. But in conjunction with my color grade, I could add in, well, let's take the color down on his beard a little bit. So let's reduce the saturation on that one. And maybe as part of my color grade, I could also take saturation down overall. So now I've got a layer which is just devoted to, if you like, a final color look. And again, if I've gone too far, I can grab opacity and we can go from 0 to 100. So color grading on a layer just kind of gives you that get out clause that if you want to just back it off a bit, you don't have to go back and undo all the sort of various steps that you've done on the background. You can just change your color grading. Extras. Oh, this was to say copy and apply. So if we had some layers on a shot, so let's just do that same again. If we had a filled layer, let's say we did a color grade like so, and we do a speed grade, similar kind of thing. That looks dreadful. 1 second. So let's take our saturation right down. So we're going to end up with something like that. Is cool. And then let's say we also had a radial like so. Grab that and let's chuck in our vignette. Something I should have prepared earlier. So let's just do that. Okay, so I want to copy and apply the same effects or the same layers onto the other shots. So if I shift select them all and we click on the little copy apply button in the layers tool itself, you can see now we have the choice, and this is new in version 20. Do you just want the radial or just the color grade or both? So if I only want to send the color grade across, I can just tick this one and say apply. And then now when we look at these shots, they just have the color grade if I didn't want the radial to be there. But of course, now if I shift select, hit copy apply, let's have the radial too, say apply. And now we've got our radial grade, radial mask as well. It's actually doubled up because I copied it twice. So just so you know, you can do that as well. And to finish, shortcuts. So if you go to edit keyboard shortcuts, it's kind of, there's, you know, a bunch of shortcuts, so it will take a while to find them. So if you just type in layer in the search, then you can see all the adjustments that are layer related. So adding different layer types, different layer opacities, and so on and so forth. So just type layer in edit keyboard shortcuts and then you can set them up exactly how you wish. Okay, last few questions and then we can finish. So let's have a look. Q&A. Okay, let's start at the top. Can you do focus stacking with layers? You can't focus stack in Capture One, but you can buy a plugin from Helicon Focus, which allows you to round trip to Helicon and back into Capture One. So Helicon focus, that's what you're looking for. Why do I never use the exposure warning function? Claude was asking. I do sometimes, but I'm kind of mindful of what the histogram is doing, so I don't necessarily need to turn on exposure warning to see what's going on. And also calibrated monitor, it's pretty easy to see where it's going to blow out as well. But if I'm worried, then I will turn it on to have a look. Pete says, can you still get the custom Logic keyboard? Oh, I don't think the cable's long enough to see it. It's just peeking into the bottom of the frame. We did, in conjunction with Logic, create the Capture One keyboard. They're not producing it anymore because they can't get that Apple-style keyboard anymore, but you might still find some at some Capture One resellers and partners. Pen setup for Wacom pen. Nothing fancy really. If we look in Wacom's system prefs, so let's go to Wacom. I change a couple of things. I don't know if this is going to focus because it's on face tracking. If I stick it to my face. So this button here, I use to scroll. So if I click the front button, then it means I can, if I had a big enough collection, hang on. So it means I can scroll. So if I hold that button and go up and down, I can scroll. And then I have right click just on the top button, this one up here. Otherwise, that's kind of about it, really. I don't use the pressure sensitivity because I'm not deft enough. And the only thing it affects in Capture One is the size. So it's actually not specially useful. It would make more sense if we linked pressure sensitivity to flow, for example. But it only works with size currently, which is a bit of a shame in my opinion. Otherwise, I don't really do anything else fancy with the pen. I just find it much more comfortable, not just in Capture One. I don't use a mouse at all. I use a pen and tablet for email, for Capture One, for video editing. I just find it much, much more comfortable. Let's see. Andy, we asked you with Luma masking, hopefully. Why does sometimes happen Capture One will calculate a mask automatically? Could be that you've got auto mask flicked on. And what auto mask will do, and it's not something I use a lot, but if you wanted to kind of do a very specific mask around something, so if we try and mask now, let's make that smaller. Turn on auto mask, we have a circle in the center, so the circle is my sample point. So now if I go along this ridge, right now I'm sampling the sky, so then it will just cut its way around. But to be honest, doing this I find is much slower than just using a luminosity mask or whacking a gradient in, and nobody will be none the wiser. And you see how long, this is taking me to do. So now we've got this part, so then I'd have to turn auto mask off, make it a bit bigger, go around the edge like so, right click, say fill mask, and then we'd have our sky mask if you like. But who's going to believe that? That just looks kind of weird. You don't have that phenomenon in real life that you have that hard edge. Light will always roll over the mountain. So to be honest, having the gradient just gives you a much more natural effect. And don't forget, as I said, if you wanted to, so this is our, whoops, wrong shortcut. Come back, Capture One. This is our grayscale mask. I could also put a Luma Range on top of that. So now if we cut out, wrong direction, if we cut out the darker tones, you could probably end up with something more like that, and then we could just fix the sky retrospectively. But I don't think there's anything wrong with how that gradient mask looks currently. And the curve picker, Simon was asking. So the curve picker just simply means that in the curve tool, if I click on that picker and click anywhere, it fixes a point for me. So I know exactly where that tonal range is to adjust, which is pretty nice. What's better, the vignette tool versus the radial mask? Well, the vignette tool works nicely for a quick fix, this one down here, but you don't have any control over the fall off. The vignette tool I think works very nicely for a lot of different aspects, but if you want more control, then you can go to the Radial Mask. There's no hierarchical meaning in the stack, so it doesn't matter what order the layers go. So if you shift them around, there's no change to the photo. It's just if you prefer them in some visual order, but it makes no difference to the end result. Any other webinars planned? You can always go to learn.capture1.com. And then you'll see, if I just bring that page up, learn.capture1.com. So if I bring this page up, so learn.capture1.com, and then you'll see upcoming webinars always in the top row. So next one is April 30th, and I'll add a few more as well. Also, if you subscribe to Facebook and YouTube, so our Facebook page and our YouTube page, whenever we go live, which is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, currently, as we're all stuck at home, at 3:30 Central European Time. I think that's 9:30 EST in the USA. You'll be able to see us live on Facebook and YouTube. No sign up required. Just come along and join in. You can type in Facebook comments or YouTube comments and so on. Alrighty, I think as we have blasted through the 60-minute barrier, we are pretty much about right. There has been a sticky offer up, but just to remind you, so this is probably already on your screen, but just to remind you, if you're a current user but you're not on version 20, you can go into the store. You do have to log in, and that means that you can upgrade to any version of Capture One or Capture One 20 from any version, and you can take 30% off the upgrade, which is pretty nice as well. There's also the code PRO25. So if you're not using Capture One, you can use the code PRO25, and that will take 25% off Capture One as well, which is super nice. So take note of that, and now's a good time to upgrade. In these times when we're all stuck at home with nothing to do but edit photos, which is great, and fix the house in my case. So thanks for joining me today. I hope that gave you a good sort of overview on working with layers. We tried to cover as much as possible. We didn't get as far as looking at creating layers from the color editor, but if you go back to previous webinars on working with color, which I think was the last one, there's a bit in there about creating a layer from the color editor as well. So check that out if that's also interesting for you. But layers are a great way for making any tool in Capture One more flexible, more awesome, and so on. Doesn't slow you down, it speeds you up. Practice makes perfect. Find a pen is easier, but don't feel you need to buy one. You can do all of what we just did with a good old mouse. So there we go. So thanks again for joining us, and if you want to join us live, tomorrow 3:30 Central European Time, we're looking at color grading, just a quickie, 20 minutes or so, and you can join in on Facebook and YouTube then. So take care everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. See you soon. Bye now.